Imagine you worked for 40 years. 40 years of alarm clocks, commutes, office politics, weekends sacrificed, vacations cut short. 40 years of telling yourself it would all be worth it someday. That someday being retirement. And then someday finally comes, and you have nothing. Not a little. Not enough to scrape by. Nothing. That is not a hypothetical. That is the real, documented, statistically verified reality for millions of Americans right now. According to the Federal Reserve's own survey of consumer finances, 46% of American households have no retirement account at all. Nearly half. Zero. Nothing set aside. And for the ones who did manage to put something away, the median balance for Americans aged 55 to 64 sits at $185,000. That sounds like a meaningful number until you do the math. Under the standard 4% withdrawal rule, that's roughly $670 a month from savings. Add in the average Social Security check, which as of 2026 is about $2,075 a month. Then subtract the Medicare Part B premium, which just jumped nearly 10% to $202.90 a month in 2026, and you are looking at somewhere around $2,489 a month to live on in this economy in 2026. That is barely enough to cover rent in most American cities, let alone actually live. And the generation we are talking about is not some forgotten, marginalized group of people. We are talking about the baby boomers, the largest, most talked about generation in American history, the generation that supposedly had it all: cheap college, affordable housing, stable jobs with real benefits, decades of economic growth that made the United States the most powerful economy on the planet. And yet, here we are. My name is John, and today I want to tell you a story. Not a simple one. Not the kind of story where we point fingers and say, they blew it, they spent everything, they just weren't responsible. Because the truth is so much more complicated and so much more heartbreaking than that. This is the story of how an entire generation of hardworking Americans got systematically set up to fail by timing, by policy, by corporate decisions made in boardrooms they were never invited into, and by two of the most devastating financial crashes in modern history. And once you understand what actually happened, I promise you, your entire view of retirement, of the stock market, and of your own financial future will never be the same again. So, let's go back to the very beginning. Because to understand why boomers are retiring broke, you first need to understand something that most people have completely wrong about retirement itself. Here is something almost nobody thinks about. Retirement, as a concept, is brand new. When I say brand new, I mean historically speaking, retirement has existed for less time than the automobile has been a common household item. For the overwhelming majority of human history, across virtually every culture and civilization that ever existed, there was no such thing as retirement. You worked, and when your body could no longer work, your family took care of you until you died. That was the entire system. The first tiny crack in that system appeared in 1875 when American Express, which at the time was a freight and package delivery company, not a credit card company, created the very first private pension plan in American history. And even then, it was not available to ordinary workers. It was for managers and executives only. If you had spent 20 years climbing the ranks, you could retire at 60 with half your salary. For everyone else, for the average American laborer, dock worker, factory hand, or farmhand, nothing. You worked until you couldn't, and then you depended on your family. It was not until 1935, just 90 years ago, within the living memory of some people still alive today, that President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed the Social Security Act into law. For the first time in American history, the federal government was making a promise to ordinary working people. Contribute to this program throughout your career, and when you get old, we will make sure you have something to live on. The very first Social Security check was mailed out in 1940. Think about that. The entire concept of a secure retirement for average Americans is barely 90 years old. Now here is where the baby boomers enter the picture. The oldest boomers were born in 1946, which means they were born right as Social Security was just getting started. Right as companies, flush with post-World War II economic prosperity, were beginning to offer pension plans to attract and retain workers. And their parents, the so-called greatest generation, became the first generation of ordinary Americans to realistically expect to retire with any kind of security. A pension from the company, Social Security from the government. You worked hard, you kept your head down, and at 65, you got to stop. And growing up, watching their parents live that version of the American dream, the boomers quite reasonably assumed they would follow the same roadmap. Work hard, get the pension, pay into Social Security, retire at 65 with dignity. It seemed simple, it seemed guaranteed, and it seemed like that was just how things worked in America. The problem is, that roadmap was about to fall apart before they even had a real chance to follow it. Let me paint you a picture of what it looked like to be a 20-year-old entering the workforce in 1966. You are the oldest of the baby boomers. You are young, you are ambitious, you probably just graduated high school or maybe college. You are starting your first real job, and you are thinking about the future. And the financial tools that we consider completely basic, completely obvious today, they do not exist yet. The 401k, not created until 1978. The index fund, also 1978. The Roth IRA, 1998. There are no investment apps. There are no discount online brokers. If you want to invest in the stock market, you have to physically call a stockbroker, pay him a substantial commission fee just to place a trade, and then try to pick individual companies to invest in, which is an intimidating, confusing, high-stakes process that the average working-class 20-year-old is not equipped to navigate. So most of them didn't. And honestly, you cannot blame them. The only system that existed, the only roadmap they had been handed, was their parents' system. Work hard, stay loyal to your company, earn your pension, pay into Social Security. That was it. That was the entire plan. And for a while, in the early years of their careers, it seemed like that system was going to hold up. But starting in the early 1960s, something started cracking. One of the most dramatic early warnings came in 1963 with a company called Studebaker. Studebaker was an automaker, at one point one of the most respected car manufacturers in America, and they had a pension plan that thousands of workers had been counting on for decades. When Studebaker shut down their plant in South Bend, Indiana that year, those workers didn't just lose their jobs, they lost their pensions. Workers who had given 20, 30 years of their lives to that company walked away with pennies on the dollar, or nothing at all. And that unintended consequence would end up accelerating the very thing it was trying to prevent. Because companies started looking at their pension obligations and thinking, is there a cheaper way to do this? That cheaper way arrived in 1978, almost by accident. And buried deep in the tax code was a small provision in Section 401, subsection K, that allowed employees to defer a portion of their salary from taxes. A benefits consultant named Ted Benna noticed it and realized it could be adapted into something much bigger, a savings vehicle where employees contributed their own money, employers could match it, and the whole thing grew tax-deferred until retirement. And thus, almost by accident, the 401k was born. At first, companies marketed it as an add-on to the pension, something extra, a bonus. But very quickly, they realized what it really was, a way to shift the entire responsibility of retirement from the employer to the employee. With a pension, the company carries the risk. If the market does badly, the company still owes workers their promised retirement income. With a 401k, the employee carries the risk. If the market crashes, that's your problem, not the company's. And so, through the mid-1980s, as the 401k became mainstream, pensions quietly disappeared. Decade by decade, company by company, the safety net that boomers had been promised was pulled out from underneath them and replaced with something that required them to manage their own retirement. Something they had zero training, zero infrastructure, and as we are about to see, zero good historical reason to trust. Now, I want you to stop for a second and really think about this from the perspective of a boomer entering the workforce in the late 60s. You are being told, either by financial advisors or by the slowly emerging 401k culture, or just by the general drift of the economy, that the stock market is where you should be putting your money for the long term. You have heard the phrase, time in the market beats timing the market. You have heard that, on average, stocks return about 10% a year, and you think, okay, fine, maybe I will try this. And then you watch what happens. From 1966 to 1982, 16 consecutive years, the US stock market went essentially nowhere. I am not talking about a slow, modest growth that felt disappointing. I am talking about a flat line, a complete stagnation. And when you factor in the inflation of the 1970s, which was absolutely brutal, inflation hit over 13% in 1979, you were not just not making money, you were losing it. A boomer who invested $1,000 in the stock market in 1966 and held on for 16 years, doing everything they were supposed to do, playing the long game, being disciplined, would have had roughly $500 of purchasing power by 1982. They would have cut their wealth in half by following the advice. This is not a small thing. This is not a minor setback that you shake off and move on from. 16 years is a career. 16 years is your 20s and your 30s. 16 years is supposed to be the most powerful compounding window of your financial life. The years where $1,000 you invest can grow into tens of thousands by the time you retire. And for boomers, that window produced nothing, less than nothing. The financial media understood how catastrophic this was. In 1979, Businessweek ran a cover story with a headline that became one of the most famous in financial journalism history, "The Death of Equities." The article argued, essentially, that the era of stocks as a serious investment vehicle was over, that inflation had killed them, that the American public had lost faith in them, and that they were never coming back. Now, Businessweek was spectacularly wrong, as we will see, but the fact that a respected mainstream financial publication was running that headline tells you everything you need to know about how the stock market was viewed at that moment. And here is the cruel irony that I keep coming back to as I tell this story. Millennials, Gen Z, has grown up in an era where the stock market has mostly gone up, where our first impression of investing was watching money grow, where we look at the market and see a wealth-building machine. The boomers' first impression was the exact opposite. They watched the stock market for 16 years and concluded, rationally, based on the evidence in front of them, that it was a trap, that you put money in and got less back, that it was something for rich people or gamblers, not for ordinary working Americans trying to build a future. So when companies started pushing 401ks in the early 1980s, when they started saying, this is the new system, this is how you retire now, put your money in the market, a huge swath of boomers hesitated. They dragged their feet. They didn't participate, or they participated minimally, or they put their contributions into the most conservative options available, money market funds, bond funds, anything that wasn't actual stocks. And I want to be completely clear. That hesitation was not stupidity. That hesitation was the rational response of people who had spent 16 years watching the market betray them. But that hesitation had a cost that many of them would never fully recover from. And then everything changed. In August of 1982, the stock market started moving, and then it kept moving, and then it accelerated. What began in 1982 became one of the most extraordinary bull runs in the history of financial markets. From 1982 to 2000, 18 years, the Dow Jones Industrial Average went from around 800 to over 11,000. That is nearly a 14-fold increase. That is the kind of sustained, compounding growth that genuinely makes people wealthy, that genuinely funds retirements, that genuinely justifies the faith that financial advisors ask you to put in the market. And slowly, for boomers who were now in their 30s and 40s, the story started to shift. The market that had looked like a scam for 16 years suddenly looked like a money machine. The 401k was becoming mainstream. Companies were offering matching contributions, and financial media, CNBC launched in 1989, money magazines were everywhere, mutual fund companies were buying television ads, the whole culture started to celebrate investing. Investing became cool. Investing became aspirational. And the stock market stopped being something that ordinary Americans were scared of and started being something they bragged about at dinner parties. By the mid-1990s, a new archetype emerged in the financial media, a kind of folk hero of the personal finance world called the 401k millionaire. These were stories about regular workers, school teachers, and factory managers and office administrators who had contributed consistently to their 401k from day one, rode the bull market faithfully, and ended up with over $1 million in their retirement account. The message was clear. The system works if you work the system. And for boomers who were now in their 40s and early 50s, this is the moment, finally, after decades of skepticism, that they genuinely believed in the market. They started contributing more aggressively. Some went heavy into growth stocks and technology companies, chasing the incredible returns of the 90s. The Nasdaq, in particular, was extraordinary. From 1990 to 2000, the tech-heavy index went up over 1,000%. They started 1,000%, and it seemed like it was never going to stop. But here is the thing I need you to understand about the timing. In 1990, the oldest boomers were 44 years old. The peak of the bull market, the greatest sustained run in stock market history, arrived when they were already deep into middle age. They had missed the early compounding years, those critical 20s and 30s when invested money has the most time to grow. And so even though many of them were finally participating, finally contributing, finally believing, they were trying to catch up from behind. Many went more aggressive with their investments than was probably wise because they felt like they had to. They were chasing what they had missed. And that desperation to catch up, combined with the infectious optimism of the late 90s bull market, is exactly what made what came next so utterly devastating. By the year 2000, the stock market had reached heights that nobody in 1966 could have imagined. The oldest boomers were 54 years old. Retirement was a decade away, maybe less. And for the first time in their lives, many of them felt genuinely good about where they stood financially. Their 401ks had grown through the bull run. The decade they had lost to stagnation seemed like ancient history. They had finally cracked it. They had finally trusted the system, and the system had rewarded them. Retirement was going to be okay. And then the dot-com bubble burst. The Nasdaq, which had risen over 1,000% in 10 years, lost 78% of its value between March 2000 and October 2002. The Dow fell 38%. And understand what that means in human terms. It means that a 401k that had grown to $400,000 through years of contributions and market growth was suddenly worth $200,000 or less. It means that the retirement that had felt real and achievable 18 months earlier was now a question mark. Their 401ks were decimated for the second time in 8 years. Their homes, which many had been counting on as a retirement asset, sell the house, downsize, pocket the equity, had lost a quarter of their value or more. Some had taken out home equity loans during the boom years and now owed more than their houses were worth. Jobs evaporated. And for a 62-year-old worker in 2008, losing your job was not just a temporary setback. Age discrimination in hiring is real and persistent, and many of those workers never recovered their former salaries. They went from six-figure careers to retail jobs, from senior positions to being invisible. Because behind every statistic in this story, there is a family that lived it. There are real people behind these numbers, and I never want us to forget that. Coming out of the Great Recession, boomers were in their late 50s and 60s. The compounding window, that magical, irreplaceable early stretch of time when small amounts of money have the most room to grow, had been closed for decades. The median retirement account balance for boomers by 2010 was around $100,000. Under the 4% rule, that produces roughly $333 a month, not $333 to supplement your other income, $333 total from your retirement savings. For the boomers who had lost everything in one or both of the crashes, the number was zero. And so they adapted the only way they could. They kept working. They downsized their homes. They delayed claiming Social Security, because the longer you wait, up to age 70, the higher your monthly benefit, hoping to squeeze a few more dollars out of a system that was designed for a different era with a different life expectancy. They took on part-time work in retirement, not for something to do, but because they had to. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, nearly 1 in 5 Americans over the age of 65 is still in the workforce today. roughly double the rate it was back in the mid-1980s when it sat at around 11%. That number is not a sign of a generation that loves work so much they can't stop. That is a generation that cannot afford to stop. And now in 2026, boomers range in age from 62 to 80. Let that land for a second. The oldest baby boomers are now octogenarians. They are turning 80 this year. And the cruelest irony of the final chapter of this story is that many of them have aged out of the professional workforce entirely. Companies don't want to hire a 75-year-old. Ageism is real, it is pervasive, and it is almost completely legal. So they are too old to get hired for the career-level jobs that pay real money, but too financially vulnerable to stop working entirely. And what's left? Walmart greeter, Uber driver, part-time cashier, minimum wage work with no benefits, no pension, no dignity, for a generation that worked for 40 years, fully expecting to earn something better. I want to be honest with you about something, because I think it is easy when we are younger to hear a story like this and feel a kind of detached sympathy. Like, that's sad, but that's not going to be me. I made that mistake for a while too. I thought because I started earlier, because I have access to better tools, because I know things that boomers didn't know, that I was somehow immune to the kind of catastrophic setback this generation experienced. And then I started actually thinking about what a 16-year stock market stagnation would do to someone who started investing at 22 today. Or what another 2008 level crash would look like if it happened when I was 55 and my retirement savings were at their peak value. And I stopped feeling quite so confident. And then what do we do with all of this? I want to give you 3 things I personally took away from putting this story together. Not as some kind of expert. I am very much not an expert. I'm just a guy who finds this stuff genuinely fascinating and wants to share what he's learned. But as someone who sat with this history for a long time and let it change the way he thinks. The first thing is this. What works right now is not guaranteed to work in 25 years. We finance creators, myself included, have a tendency to talk about investing like it is a solved problem. Start early, invest in index funds, hold for 30 years, retire rich, and maybe that works out. But this story forced me to genuinely reckon with the fact that there are no guarantees. The boomers had a system too. It was a good system, a rational system, and it failed them. Not because they were stupid or irresponsible, but because the world changed around them in ways that nobody predicted. I am not saying don't invest. I am saying invest with the humility to know that the ground can shift. The second thing is this. The stock market is not the benevolent machine that my generation has learned to see it as. I have only really invested during good years. I have a fundamentally optimistic relationship with the market because my experience with it has been positive. But the boomers' story is a reminder that there are people alive today who watched the market go nowhere for 16 years, then watched it cut their savings in half twice. Their experience of the market was not irrational. It was the result of living through a different set of historical circumstances. And I have no way of knowing whether my circumstances will stay favorable. Nobody does. And the third thing, the most human thing, I think, is this. Please do not wait until retirement to live your life. I know that is the kind of thing that sounds like a motivational poster, and I know it can be used to justify all kinds of irresponsible financial decisions. So let me be clear that I am not saying blow your savings on vacations and ignore your retirement account. What I am saying is that this story is full of people who deferred their entire sense of life satisfaction to a finish line called retirement. And for many of them, that finish line moved, or the goalposts shifted, or the savings that were supposed to get them there got wiped out, and they spent the best years of their health and energy grinding towards something that never arrived. Build wisely, save consistently, take the long view. But do not treat retirement as the destination where your real life begins. Because if this story teaches us anything, it is that the future is not promised. The system can change, the market can betray you, and the only time you actually have is right now. My name is John, and I want to thank you sincerely for watching this all the way through. I know this was a long one, and I know it wasn't exactly light viewing, but I think stories like this one, the real, complicated, uncomfortable ones, are the most important ones to tell and to hear. Because financial literacy is not just about knowing which accounts to open or which funds to buy. It's about understanding the history, understanding the forces that shape people's financial lives, and developing a kind of earned humility about the future. The boomers were not a lazy generation. They were not a reckless generation. They were a generation that got dealt a genuinely difficult hand: stagnation, policy shifts, corporate betrayals, and two of the worst financial crashes in modern American history, and they played it as best they could with the tools they had. Some of them made it. A lot of them didn't, and the ones who didn't deserve our compassion, not our judgment. If this video meant something to you, if it shifted how you think about any of this, I would genuinely love it if you hit the like button. It makes an enormous difference for this channel, and it takes about half a second. And if you want to keep going down this rabbit hole with me, I do a lot of videos on economic history, financial systems, and the stories behind the numbers that shape our lives. There is a link right on your screen to another video I think you will find just as compelling. I will see you in the next one.